In spite of all the negative things going on around us, isn't it good to be reminded that this is the acceptable time of the Lord? The time for salvation, recovery, restoration, and renewal. The time of grace. This is that time. Jesus declared that he was the one who had come to proclaim the good news, deliverance, healing, restoration, the opportunity to put things back the way they were intended to be. Most importantly, to recover our relationship with God. As we saw on Sunday, we are reconciled to reconcile others. 2 Corinthians 5:19 reads, God was in Christ, reconciling the world to himself, not imputing their trespasses to them, and has committed to us the word of reconciliation. Now, there are two aspects of this that I want us to explore today. First, we are ambassadors. Paul continued writing in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 20, we are ambassadors for Christ, as though God were pleading through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. Ambassadors for Christ. An ambassador is an official envoy who represents a sovereign. Usually this is a national leader. An ambassador is specifically selected to represent that sovereign, many times with a very specific mission. If you think about it, Paul is indicating here that Jesus was, in a sense, an ambassador for the Father. Go back to verse 18. Paul had said, God has reconciled us to himself through Jesus Christ. Well, now Jesus has passed that role of ambassador on to first the apostles and then the church. So what Paul describes here in verse 20, when we are reconciled, we are ambassadors for Christ. It is as though God is pleading through us. Let me say that again. It is though God is pleading through us when we urge others to be reconciled. You see, when an ambassador speaks, it's not about that ambassador. The ambassador speaks for the sovereign. The ambassador is simply delivering the message from the sovereign. So when we are ambassadors for Christ, it is as though it's not us who's speaking. It is as though God is speaking through us. We are delivering the message. Now, someone might reject that message, but it isn't us that they are rejecting. I say that because sometimes Christians, believers, are nervous about sharing their faith because what if somebody rejects me? What if somebody gets offended? What if somebody doesn't like what I have to say? In church, we need to remember, when we are sharing the message of reconciliation, we are simply the ambassadors. We are the messengers. We're simply delivering God's message. And if that message is going to be rejected, it's not us that's being rejected. It's the message that we are delivering from the sovereign. Now, on the other hand, we should remember that the message is not ours, it is his. It's God. So not only should we not fear rejection, we should proclaim that message with boldness and confidence because it's God's message, and that carries some weight. We are ambassadors for Christ. Well, the second aspect I want to look at this evening is that we are ambassadors with a purpose. Paul goes on in chapter 6, verse 1, to write, we then, as workers together with him, also plead with you not to receive the grace of God in vain. This is an interesting statement that Paul makes. Remember, he is writing to the Corinthian church. I think he's making sort of a double-edged point here. First, of course, he's issuing somewhat a warning. God's provided for your reconciliation. Don't mess this up. Don't miss it. Receive it. Begin the process of recovery and restoration to what he intended you to be. Don't simply give mental assent to God's message of reconciliation, God's plan. Just say, well, yeah, that sounds cool, and then be satisfied with the old you. Paul had just said a few moments earlier, the old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new. So I think part of what he's saying here, when he's saying not to receive it in vain, is not to just receive it in this kind of mental sense and not really make it something that changes your life, that makes everything begin to become new again and restore us back to what we are intended to be. But there's a second aspect of it, I think, this double-edged sword. Again, remember, he's writing to the church. And I think he's making the case here that we've been reconciled to reconcile others. We are ambassadors for Christ. And notice that he begins this verse by declaring that he and the Corinthian church are workers together. Now is that window of opportunity, he says. Now is that time of grace for the church to do its work as ambassadors, delivering the good news of reconciliation. Church, I think part of this message is for you and me. As we emerge from the devastation of COVID and the other awful events of 2020, this message, be reconciled to God, will be more needed than ever for your friends, your family, neighbors, yes, even some enemies. Let's be ready.